My name is Pieter Venter, and this is my colleague Pavel. We're going to be presenting on the secrets of the MyGeotab SDK. So if you didn't know that we have an SDK, I'll count that as secret number one. Or maybe you wandered into the wrong session, but stick around, maybe you'll learn something. We have spent some time to solicit feedback from resellers. We looked on the forums. We spoke to our support staff to try and figure out what are the things using our SDK that people get tripped up on, or what are the things that people don't typically know about. So we've collected all these things together and put it in some slides. I'll be doing most of the talking, and Pavel is going to be doing some demonstrations as well. It will probably take the full 45 minutes, but there will be some time afterwards for questions. I know after the session is lunch, so also feel free to stick around afterwards. We'll be here, and we can field some individual questions if you want to. So before we get stuck into that, I want to just touch upon some of the history of our SDK. Back in 2005, when customers hosted the software themselves, we actually had an SDK. But this was a very different beast. There was no documentation. It was essentially a C# DLL. And with a little bit of help and phone calls and stuff, you could kind of get by and get access to the data. The point is, back in those days, we realized we really want to make it accessible to people. We felt that the data needs to be close to the customer. Let's not hide it away. Let's try and give them access to that. When MyGeotab became a web-based platform, we realized how important it will be to create a good API and an SDK so that people can help themselves to the data. So in 2013, we established our first version of the SDK, which was essentially a JSON RPC-based protocol over HTTP. So it's a contract that says if you make this method call, we'll turn results in a specific format. That started taking off, but people felt, I need to build features right into the product. I don't want to have a standalone application. I want to extend the product. And we developed the idea of add-ins. And this is where you can actually embed your code directly within our user interface. And it was using the same APIs that we made available the year before. It wasn't long after that where people said, well, I've made these add-ins, but people can't discover it. They don't know that it even exists. And the marketplace was born. So the marketplace is a place where you can go and discover and find add-ons that people have created. And it also created a revenue opportunity for our partners. In 2016, we added a couple more APIs, the storage API and the SAML API. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of those features later in the talk. So I just want to show a little graph of growth that we've experienced in the SDK usage over 2015 to 2018. Neil spoke a lot about the big data, and one of the things we do is every single API call that gets made to our platform gets recorded, that a call was made. So this is kind of, I just took a Wednesday every week for the last 3 years. And you'll notice that we're almost up to 1 billion API calls per day. So this is a tremendous amount of information that's flowing between our infrastructure and either a browser or some kind of integration that people have built. And this has put a lot of pressure on us to try and figure out how do we scale systems, how do we keep things up. So one of the themes, one of the things that we'll talk about a bit later is also making sure that if you use the SDK, that you use it in a responsible manner. It is quite possible that you can write an application that can affect the server and the infrastructure in a negative way. So this has been by no means an easy task. You can imagine having to have, I think there's about 600 or 700 servers that's required to service this number of requests. So tremendous growth. So I want to start with the first secret, and that is that we really try not to keep secrets. When it comes to our SDK and our API, it's fundamental to what we do is we want to make it free to you. You don't pay any extra money to get access to the SDK. We provide you with documentation. We provide you with forums for support. There's some videos, if you haven't been through them, that show you step by step how you can do certain actions. as well as code examples. You can go up and you can see the source code, and you can go and review how certain common operations can be done. It's really in our interest for you to succeed. We really want to try and go out of our way to make that possible. So we're announcing today that we're making available the entire SDK on GitHub. So GitHub is where developers go to collaborate, to build software, and we've decided we'll put it up there in warts and all, to give you guys access to everything that's there and help us make it better. So many of you have had feedback, say, hey, can you help make this method a little bit clearer, or maybe there's some nuance around it. This will allow you to have pull requests and kind of collaborate around the SDK itself. So I see Steve is in the audience here, and Steve did most of the work here, so thank you, Steve, for this effort. But instead of me just talking about it, I'm going to hand over to Pavel, and he's going to give you a quick run-through on the GitHub SDK.
Already? Thank you. Hi. Before we go, I'd like to talk about a little bit about changes that our SDK went through from MyGeotab hosted platform to GitHub itself. And before we can talk about the change, let's take a look at how SDK looked like before. This is mygeotab.com/SDK. That's probably the only place where you can see the SDK as it was before. And it's quite usual one. There are articles, some getting started guides. I'm getting started. References, runners. That's a good one. If you have login and password from any of MyGeotab servers, you can actually experiment in runtime, try to make some calls, see the result, think how you will integrate it into your application. It also has a cool thing. Where is examples? Code samples. So there are lots of examples, like how do you create vehicle, get data feed, prepare small report, all this stuff. So what exactly changed? This is a new SDK, and apparently styles changed a little bit. The most noticeable, it's in mobile applications, like this is a before and after. So the styles got cleaner, it's easier to read, hopefully easier to understand. What's cool is, I mentioned JavaScript examples. Now you can run them directly from SDK. So lots of links, for example, display odometer. Demo, the biggest problem of this sample is me, because our password requirement needs me to use like long string with lots of characters, upper lower cases. And I honestly tried to do it this morning and yesterday, and 1 out of 4 attempts succeeds. So let's go right there. This is how it looks. That's one of the samples you'll find in our SDK. But still, the biggest change is GitHub. So it doesn't make sense for us to create SDK and hold it to ourselves and think, okay, we did it, it worked, we're cool. It's actually meant to be used by you. So GitHub is a place where open source live and where the collaboration happens. So the whole point of this, you have full access to the full SDK. If you see something wrong, please create an issue, tell us about it, we'll respond, we'll fix it. We can discuss it. I saw there's a discussion here already, and it looks like it was resolved. If you have any questions, also please submit them there. Ask someone will answer. Most likely it will be Steve. Hey. Maybe somebody else. I saw Mike also over there. What even better, many things you probably can do better than us. Like you understand how your program will work, what kind of sample you would want to use. If you know how to create it or fix something that you think we should have done better, do it, create a pull request. It will be gratefully accepted. Well, we'll have to review some code style, but if you can contribute, please, that's perfect. That's the whole point of this endeavor. And that's, let me check my slides. That's probably it for this part. Please contribute. Back to you, Pieter. And present.
Thanks, Pavel. Yeah, so there's some really cool stuff. The idea that you can just click on the demo and run it straight from there just removes that little bit of friction that we had in the past. We had to download files. You don't really know where to start. As long as you have a login to MyGeotab, you can just click and run. So secret number 2 is that the API and the SDK is actually language and platform agnostic. We sometimes get the question from people saying, well, I don't use C#, so how am I supposed to integrate with your product? The reality is we don't think of it as a C#-based or a .NET-based SDK. Really, the only thing that we care about in our API is the over-the-wire protocol between yourself and the server. So as long as you speak JSON RPC over HTTP, we'll be happy. Our server doesn't care whether you're running on Java, whether you've written in Python, if it's C or some other language. Now, we do recognize that if you had to start there and make JSON RPC calls directly, it's kind of messy because you need to know a lot of things about, well, what do the objects look like, what are the methods. So we provide you with a few convenient wrappers. So the JavaScript object, there's a C# one, there's a Python one. We provide that to you as a convenience, but some of our resellers and some of our partners have created their own wrappers in the language of their choice. And sometimes you don't even have to go that far. If all you wanted to do is consume a particular get feed, it's very simple to get going in any language. So just be aware, this is not something that only runs on Windows. It runs on Mac, it runs on Windows, it runs on Linux. We have a .NET Core-based version as well now, so you can run this. If you use .NET, you can also run it on Linux and other platforms. Secret number 3. This secret people sometimes find out the hard way, and that is that your database may move. So what does that mean? Well, as you probably know, if you sign into MyGeotab, you go to my.geotab.com, you sign in, you wait a little while, and the next thing you arrive at my34.geotab.com, and that's where your data resides. And off you go, you can use the application, and typically what people do when they start building an integration, they go, okay, my data lives on my34. The reality is the infrastructure that we have to support this billion requests is very elastic. It may scale. We may take that server, split it in half, and make 2 servers from that. So the database that you have won't live on my34 forever. It may, after a Sunday maintenance, pop out, and it's now my134. So be aware of this. Don't hard code anything into your application. Don't create a configuration file that is assuming it's going to be on a particular instance where you saw, when you authenticate, when you saw that response coming back. Our documentation shows the process flow, what it means when you authenticate, and how it tells you which server you're on. But you must also expect that at any time you may get a response from the server saying authentication failed, and when you re-authenticate, it comes back and say, by the way, your password was correct, but your server has moved to somewhere else. The wrappers that we provide you already take that into account. But if you are going to do this yourself, please be aware that your database may move. Now, we understand this is a little bit of an inconvenience. So on our roadmap, we've been discussing a way in which we can hide that complexity from you. And you'll basically just go to my.geotab.com, one URL. You sign in, you get your token, and off you go. And that this redirection is eliminated. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, at the scale that we're operating in now, it's pretty difficult to build a single entry point that can scale to the billion requests per day. So we're cautiously going down this road, but it's on our roadmap, and hopefully at some point, we'll be able to announce that we have that single URL convenience. But until then, you have to be aware that your database may move. Secret number 4, you really should be using a session ID. So in order to describe what that means, let me start from the beginning. When you authenticate yourself to a server, the response is, where's your database? And also, it gives you some token back. That is your session ID. In some instances, we found that people just ignore the token, and every time they make another call, they re-authenticate every time they make a call. And that causes problems on our side. And the reason for that is that we really can't be storing your password. Back in the day when we just started everyone was naive. You put the password in the database. It's very easy for support. If you forget it, we can just look and tell you what it is. But the world has woken up to this thing about security. And we can't be doing that. Nobody can know what your password is but you. So when you create your account, we take your password and we put it through a really complicated hashing algorithm that goes through tens of thousands of iterations of SHA-256 hashing and creates this weird number and stores that away. So the next time you present your password, we have to do all that work again to figure out, is it the same password that you provided originally? So it's computationally really, really expensive to be validating your password every time you talk to us. And that's where the session ID comes in. So instead of doing that, we say to you, no, you told us the correct password, here's a session ID. So please send that back next time so we don't have to do that hard work of validating what your password is. So to protect our infrastructure, we won't actually allow you to do more than a certain number of authentication attempts in a period of time. We realize that sometimes people make programming mistakes, the thing just goes into a loop and just keeps calling us. So if you start exceeding that limit that we set there, we'll just reject the call altogether and say, sorry, but you can't be authenticating this many times. I don't know if it's legit, a bug, or some kind of hacking attempt that's going on. So again, from a roadmap perspective, we would like to give you guys something else, which is the idea of having a more long-lived session. So sometimes you have, you may have a service that needs to communicate with MyGeotab. So it would be quite convenient to, instead of having just a username and password, that you can use your account and create a token that never expires until you explicitly do so. Create that token, then pass that onto your application. It can just kind of basically like a service account. So this is another item on our roadmap, something that I think will be useful, that you can go into essentially your user manager and see that there's a token that's being used by some application, and that you can explicitly close that token down if you want to, but it also doesn't expire, which means you can just keep using it for as long as your service needs to run. We support SAML. So SAML is the security assertion markup language. If you're not familiar with this, I'll give you a kind of brief introduction. It's actually quite a basic concept where it's an exchange of XML information that allows you to offload your authentication to a third party. And how that works is you give us, it uses public-private key certificates, and you give us a certificate that we store in MyGeotab. And when it comes time to sign in, a third party can send us a bit of information, and we can verify that it came from that third party by checking the certificate, and therefore vouching for the fact that if I came from Google, that it was actually Pieter and he was authenticated at some point with Google. So what's nice about this is it allows you to go from, let's say you've got Google Apps installed on your browser. You can actually have a link that takes you to MyGeotab and you just log in. You never actually had to put your own credentials in there. We never touch your password. We don't know what your password is. We don't even have to hash your password. So SAML is something that's supported in MyGeotab today. And I believe Nathan and some of the guys will be doing some talks later during the conference. So if you're interested in this kind of technologies, please go check that out. And one of the kind of roadmap items that we have, I'll talk about this a little later, is some other ways of single sign-on like OAuth 2 and so forth. Now, this is a pretty cool thing. There's some information on GitHub as well on this. But many businesses uses G Suite. So Google, Gmail, Google Docs, Google Sheets to run their businesses. It's one of the most popular platforms for managing documents and information. It's possible to create a MyGeotab integration directly from within G Suite. So for example, you can have a Google Sheet that you can tabulate data, but you can have a function in there that returns vehicle information, trip information, even little thumbnails of mapping information. Again, on the GitHub site, so github.com/geotab, there's some really good examples of how you can create this within G Suite. And we've seen some people really make interesting spreadsheets and basically bring the Geotab data closer to the users. Because you don't need to use MyGeotab. Just use the spreadsheet, and you can see the odometer values right in there, and it's automatically updated. Like I said, the example is on GitHub, and there's also a video. If you're not sure how to use it, that you can run through, and it takes you half an hour, and you would have built one of these things. If you're a .NET developer, we package the C# code in a NuGet package. So what this means is NuGet is just a way of distributing assemblies down to your computer if you want to develop an application. So you can open up Visual Studio, you go add reference, and search for Geotab SDK, and it'll find the NuGet package that contains all the code that you need to interact with our system. And you can start building your application straight away. Now, this NuGet package is also maintained. So over time, we may be adding some APIs, or we may be doing bug fixes or improvements. So do check from time to time. Just go to your NuGet package manager, check for updates, and get the latest version straight from there. So this is really a convenient way to get started. There's nothing else to download. You can do it straight from Visual Studio. So I want to announce today, this is in a preview mode, which means the API itself we may want to tweak a little bit. But we want to announce that you actually can decode vehicle identification numbers using the SDK. So you may have seen within MyGeotab, if you open the device editor, we'll show you make, year, model, and some information about the vehicle. We've spent the last 5 years collecting information from all the OEMs about how they decode their VINs. It's all public information, but we've collected this, and we've got a massive database of understanding how each make, year, and model gets broken down. So we're making this available through the API. So if you actually want to have some kind of portal of your own where you integrate with Geotab, you can make a call to us, and we will try and break down what that VIN means for you. Now, we have quite a lot of success in the North American market for VINs. The European vehicles actually don't follow the standard as closely as they should. In fact, some of them largely ignore the standard. But we've made some advancements as well to break down European vehicles by make, year, and model. It is a bit of a catch-up game because every year there's new cars coming out, there's new codes coming in, so we maintain this list. But I think we've got a very good coverage, at least in the North American space when it comes to VIN decoding. There's no specific limitations on this. It's like any of the other APIs. You don't pay for this. It's not anything extra. And some of these VIN decoding sites, you can pay quite a bit of money just to get this one particular service if you went out to the market and try and did this. Okay, then the next topic I want to bring up is another preview API. And that is a very kind of innovative way in which you can consume reports through our API. So as you guys know, one of the cornerstones of the MyGeotab product is the ability to create an Excel report, add your own formulas in there, remove columns, add columns, do what you need to, save it, and then upload it back to the system. That allows you to create dashboards and other views in PDF for information that's relevant to your customer's business. But one of the things you can't do is programmatically access the information inside that Excel report. It's essentially a file. You've got to download the file, and then you've got to do something with it. But what if we can expose cell information, in other words, the actual raw data that's in that Excel file through an API? And that's what this is. So you can take an existing report, slice and dice it in a way that you see fit, and then upload it just like you would. But instead of having to be confined to a download link or a PDF, you can make a programmatic call and get the information. And I'm going to hand over to Pavel, who's going to show you in a bit more detail how that works.
Thank you. Okay, and I think I'll need my slides this time. All of them. Cool. So MyGeotab had Excel and PDF reporting since the beginning of time, like forever. And the problem with Excel and PDF for me is, like, as a programmer, I like to automate things, to pipe data streams from one side to another. So as a human, I have to deal only with the result where a machine cannot do. Excel data and PDF data is not that kind of data. It still can be processed further to drive me closer to my decision, but I can parse Excel file and pipe it to something else. But come on. So essentially, PDF and Excel are dead ends from integration point of view. So with JSON, it actually changes the picture quite a lot, because with JSON you can continue from that, right from that point, create new reports, new integration services, create new apps, like whatever you want. You can, that's all the data is there. So this is a comparison of old API call for getting Excel data and new API call for getting report JSON. The green area is the parameters which are still the same. So basically, you don't have to learn anything new if you already use get Excel API call. There's an open ticket. I created it a few days ago. There's a chance that there won't be new call to begin with. It still be get Excel, but with one more parameter. Like it's already had in the very bottom, you might see. Can you hand this here? Okay, thank you. There's output colon PDF parameter. We might just add output colon JSON, and that's it. And the result is, I disappeared for a while. And the result is actually, it's the very same data as you would receive in Excel report. So it's by row, by column, it has some metadata, when report was generated, what columns are, what formatting options. So whatever you could extract from Excel is right there. And like taking, for example, a risk management report, you receive the Excel, you probably might create similar report by using direct API calls. Get devices, get exceptions, get something else. It would take much longer, and actually there's not everything you can receive through API calls. Reporting API have a little bit more access to the data. So having this report, I created a small demo, and hopefully I'll remember how to start it now. Node.js server. Okay, much better. It's listening, and let's go to Mighty browser. Just refresh to show you that it's a real thing. It's not a screenshot. Hey, it's still working. I'm always happy when it happens. So that's it. Can I zoom it? Oh, wonderful. It's like a programming. So the beauty of it, it took me like close to nothing to build completely new report using this MyGeotab data for that risk management Excel report. And like the first thing that I did just for me, like I was curious, I don't care about vehicles which haven't moved, for example. These vehicles are included in default risk management report, but I don't want them. Like what kind of risk they could pose for me. So I removed them. I removed all the columns I don't care about and just used the simplest Google chart to put this data. And just by default, it's sortable, scrollable. Like I've gotten small new MyGeotab. What's cool is very easy to experiment. For example, what if I map speeding violations number against number of, I don't know, against average speed, for example. And there's no great reveal. I mapped it, it looks like this, and it looks like, surprisingly, there's some correlation between average speed and the number of violations. But what was more interesting, somehow it looks like they clustered. Here it's not really obvious, but let me find another screenshot. Oh, yeah, it's here. So somehow they kind of cluster in areas of number of speeding violations and the range of the speed they get. So there might be something for our big data team to do, but the point is that was very easy to do with this new API. And from the code point of view, I don't know if there's anything interesting here. API helpers, that's just an API call. Make API call, get report JSON, arguments, sheet name report, because by default, our Excel report has 3 sheets, like metadata, raw data, formatted data, summary, and this one I just want this one. And that's probably it. Use this new API. It's really cool. So many integrations can be done. It's beyond imaginable. Like you can take one report and then get some data to run it through another report, and wow, it's so cool. And that's for this demo. That's it.
Thanks, Pavel.
Pieter?
Yeah, so maybe just to wrap up that point is, as Pavel showed you there, instead of having a dashboard, for example, that's just got a static image, is what you get today, you can grab that data and then use some kind of JSON or some kind of control, JavaScript control, so that you can mouse over and actually inspect the individual points. I think the people in this audience will probably appreciate that instead of just having an image, you can now actually interact with that data or feed the result of that data. It almost makes the Excel file a kind of mini compute engine that you can actually calculate values and formulas in there and then use the result in some other way and, through a program. It's really cool. So one of the things that people trip up on is the feed API. And the feed API is usually more efficient than using just the normal get method. So let me start from the beginning. There are typically two ways in which you can get data out of our system. So one of them is called get feed. So get feed with log record as the argument will say you're interested in some kind of incremental or relative feed of the information. And then you also get the get variant, which simply says I want an absolute range of information. So the difference there is that with get feed, you typically expect to get a different result every time you make the call. So every time you make a call, you're going to get a result, and if you make it the next time, you're going to get a different result. The get variant of this is absolute. So if I say, give me the log records for yesterday, if I call it 10 times, I expect to get the same result each time I call it. So let's look at a small diagram of how this really works. So if we start with kind of segment number 1, is we're going to call get feed, and initially you don't have any kind of token. So you just call get feed with an empty token being passed in. The server will then see you haven't provided me a token and provide you with a result set that starts basically from the beginning of time. So say, okay, you haven't given me a token, I'm just going to start from the beginning, and it will limit itself to a certain size result, but it will say, okay, let's say here's 50,000 log records for you. You then take that result, you consume it, maybe you put it in a CSV file, you stick it in a database somewhere. And while this is happening, more data is arriving. Now, the cycle then repeats, but this time you're going to take the token that we return to you in step 2 and pass that along. And that's basically a marker that allows us to kind of incrementally catch you up to the latest information. So this cycle just endlessly repeats. Now what's nice about that cycle is that you can control both the frequency and the size of the information that you want back. So for example, if you just want to consume the feed once a day, it's up to you. You just call us once a day. And you can also specify how much information can you receive at per cycle. And that allows essentially a nibbling feed. You can nibble away at the data until you realize, okay, I'm not getting anything back anymore, so I'm done for the day, and then you stop. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that it's more efficient to do it this way. So what is happening really is behind the scenes, the feed is driven by a relational database. And this relational database has certain characteristics about how easy it is to find certain information points. So we've really optimized it to say, just take this token and let's get the next batch of data that you need. But we do allow some search criteria. You can, for example, say, hey, I want the feed, but I just want the fuel data. And what we have found in certain cases is if you have a customer with a massive amount of data, that it can actually be quite difficult on the back end to go and figure out, well, between all these billions of points, which ones are the fuel points. So I would say, to play it safe, in many instances, all you have to do is ignore the search parameter, just consume all the data, and throw away the things you don't want. That is kind of the optimal way for us to just go start from the beginning and go all the way through. So there are instances where the large customers, if you're having trouble and the feed calls start timing out, it's probably because the infrastructure is having a really hard time honoring the search parameters that you've put in there. So just a little tip there, it's okay to consume the data and throw away the things that you're not interested in, as opposed to trying to narrow down. You're actually making more work for us to try and narrow down just the records that you want to return. It's completely fine to return all of it. Now, one of the things, if you're using this feed API, that can trip you up is trips. And that is because trips can change. Trips can change until they can't. So let me explain what I mean by that. A trip is pretty much what you think it is. It is a period of driving followed by a period of stopping. So I get in my car, I drive somewhere, I stop. And then I do my shopping, I get back in the car, and I drive. And that cycle just continues. The problem is, what do we do with the last trip? So I've just driven somewhere, and I've arrived somewhere, and now I'm stopped. What's actually going on is that every time there's a heartbeat or some bit of information that comes from the vehicle, we realize, oh, you're stopping for a little bit longer. I thought you were stopped for 10 minutes, but now I just got another point. Now you stopped for 12 minutes. And if we get another point, we go, oh, you stopped for 15 minutes, and so on. So this stop time kind of creeps up. And the only time that that kind of cements is when you start moving again. So there's this unknown period while you stopped until you've moved, where that trip will change. So let's say you're consuming a trip feed. I call get feed, I pass the token in, and I get a trip back. And then I call you again, and I get the same trip back, but this time the stop time is a little bit different. That is the reason why. Only once you start moving with your next trip, we realize, okay, we now know how long it took for you to drive, how long you stopped, and that trip from that point forward will become stationary and fixed. So don't be surprised when you start consuming a trip feed that you'll get these duplicates at the edge every time because the vehicles haven't quite settled in what is the end of that trip. Secret number 12 is that security is not actually just our problem. It's also your problem. Some of you on the marketplace may have been contacted by Geotab to say, hey, we looked at some of the stuff you've got there, and we think there's a cross-site scripting vulnerability in your code. So the reality is we share the code space with you. When you build an add-in, you give us JavaScript and HTML and CSS. It runs alongside the MyGeotab code. So we do a ton of work to try and make sure our application is secure. We use Veracode for static code analysis. We use BugCrowd for bug bounty programs. We do penetration testing. We do code reviews. We train our staff. But none of those things are going to matter when somebody builds an add-on that is full of security vulnerabilities. So if you're in the space, even if you're building your own portal, you have to pay attention to security because you may compromise your customer system if you have flaws in your own code. So a couple of tips. Some of the basic things like escape your content properly. You don't want to end up having some cross-site scripting issue or a SQL injection attack or a path traversal issue in there. If these words don't mean anything to you, Google the OWASP top 10. So it's an organization that every year reviews what are the top 10 vulnerabilities that you should care about if you have an application on the internet. This is a great place to start. They have remediation and all sorts of technical information for whatever language you're involved in. And it is something that we cannot ignore. As I say, in the early days, we kind of felt, hey, let's enable you to build these applications. But now we're at the point where enabling is not enough. We've got to enable it in a responsible and a secure manner. We have very active forums. So if you walk out of here and you're building an application, you don't know, you get stuck with something. There's multiple places now where you can go and get help. There's a very, very active forum, forum.geotab.com, about the product as a whole. So not just the SDK, but there's various other hardware forums, software forums, as well as the SDK. And we typically try and respond within 24 to 48 hours, and you'll see Steve's name against most of them. But there's also many of you that's been contributing. It's amazing to see how the knowledge has spread, and there's partners that actually monitor the forums themselves and help out. So if you're just getting started in this stuff, there's a tremendous amount of information locked up in those forums. And the forums, as well as the GitHub issues and the discussions on the actual source code, will work together to give you a very rich set of information about how to use our SDK. We spoke about this at the last Connect, and I wanted to just put a reminder out there that we do actually allow you to create a custom registration experience. One of the things that resellers love to do is to say, I don't just sign a customer up. I sign a customer up, and then I go and create these additional groups, or I enable certain rules, or I set up dashboards in a way that I know is going to serve that customer best. And they often find that they just keep doing the same work over and over and over. So we created a sample that is open source. You can see how it's done, that allows you to capture the same information and then inject your own JavaScript code or other code to automate some of those processes. So there's a sample that allows you to export a current configuration as well as import a configuration programmatically. So please go and check that out. So I got two more points left, and then we'll get to some of the questions, and Pavel's going to do one more cool demo at the end. So secret number 15 is that some points are interpolated. Now, you may discover this by surprise when you use the API, because we allow you to make arbitrary questions about our data. For example, you can make a call to MyGeotab and say, what is your GPS position at exactly 12 o'clock? And it'll come back and say, that's your position at 12 o'clock. Now, the reality is, we don't record the position for every moment in time, so what actually happened there? It's probably best illustrated on a little graph. In this graph, the blue numbers are actual samples that the MyGeotab system recorded. But the green one is the question that you're asking. So you can go along the time axis at the bottom and at any time say, hey, what is the, let's say this is, I don't know, some voltage value. And we will linearly interpolate between 5 and 8 that at the point in time that you ask for it, that is what the number, that is what the voltage reading would have been. So how can we do that? The MyGeotab device actually uses a very sophisticated logging algorithm to monitor the voltage inputs, to monitor the GPS in a way that we guarantee that we're going to get the high points and the low points at certain predefined, well, first of all, at a predefined time interval, but more importantly, as the data changes, so that it's not simply every 5 seconds or every 20 seconds. If the value drastically changes within 2 seconds, we'll log all the ups and all the downs. And this allows us to, within reason, interpolate values between, between two data points that we've recorded. So how do you know that the information that you're looking at was recorded by the device or was interpolated? Well, it's quite simple, and that is that the record will come back and it actually doesn't have an ID. So as you know, a lot of the log records, the status data, all those records have a unique identifier. If it's missing the unique identifier, it means it's a value that we interpolated or calculated between those 2 points. And for the last slide, I'm going to hand over to Pavel, because he said, well, the MyGeotab API can do all these things, but can it talk? So let's see.
Yeah, that's actually my favorite demo. So I don't know how about your relationships with your first car. For me, it was late teenage years, and for me, car was like everything. Like it's a house on wheels, it's freedom, it's almost a friend. If only it could talk. So only today, ladies and gentlemen, Node, index.js, and gods of MyGeotab servers. Please work today, all of you. Can you see it? Okay, so somebody. Hello, I'm your car.
Can you make it bigger, Pavel?
Let's give it a try. Oh yeah, technology is cool. Few more and few more. Okay, so what can I do for you? What can you do? That's nice. So, okay, so who are you? And that might take some time. Okay, I'm a Toyota Corolla Matrix 2010, estimated mileage is something something. Actually, mileage is a lie, because I probably using the wrong API call. But what's cool is Toyota Corolla Matrix 2010, it's not hard-coded. The only thing I provided was device ID. I know it's my device, I know its ID. The rest of the data was fetched by this Wing decoding API that Pieter mentioned before. What else? Where are you? Cool. So it's not in my home. Somebody took it. Probably my wife. Okay. No, that's planned. That's planned. That's okay. So that was cool. Actually, I can. So that's the whole idea. API is not just for using in reports, in smaller applications, in click and point on something. It's like a puzzle. If you pick the right pieces, like you can build anything. Here I took Microsoft Bot Framework, connected it to our SDK, and out of nowhere I can use voice, text-to-speech, voice recognition, text messaging. Like that's kind of my personal toy, but for example, imagine you own a small fleet, you're driving to office in the morning, you can ask like, okay, Google, Alexa, Cortana, what's happening? And this is what happened in the morning. These drivers are late, these are violating something, these doing something else. Again, for more personal usage, it's fairly easy to connect such kind of things to Alexa, Google Home, something else. Like I got used to come home and say, okay, Google, turn on the light or something. And the rooms which don't have this feature, they're such an inconvenient places to be. So it's also cool would be to ask like, okay, where is my car? What is the fuel level? Like, how are you doing in general? Like maybe the flats are tired. And I think we have diagnostics at some vehicles to detect if tires are flat. So that's how cool it is. And that's the same dialogue. And implementation is fairly simple. So bot frameworks, they usually work in a dialogue-based manner. You have a set of dialogues, they perform just a graph, and your conversation flows from one dialogue to another one. And here, this is a small place where dialogue meets API. It's this line, number 22. API helpers get device status with address. And beneath it, it's just simple API calls. Get latest device, get device status info, I think, and the other one is get address. And that's it. It was really easy to connect these two things together. Maybe the most difficult one was to come up with idea, what should I ask my car about? If I ask about how's it going, that might be a few weekends of programming about the whole lots of things can be happening with the car. So that's a sample. And you can talk with it. Isn't that cool? I can actually I can talk to it now, but for now only Google understands my dialect of English, and not always actually. So this is it. This is my demo. And back to you, Pieter.
Thanks, Pavel. That was really cool. I love that kind of stuff. I think you can also think of it in a business sense. You may have a customer that is delivering parcels or something, and you can imagine a bot where you can interact with and say, how far away is my delivery and that kind of thing. So to automate and kind of make a lot of these things more convenient. So I want to close off with a few future considerations, just kind of going over some of the things I mentioned in the past. So we're looking at implementing some kind of long-running sessions for services. We are also considering more single sign-on options. So although SAML is pretty cool, and you can use it if you use Active Directory or Google, it is a little bit more tricky. If you just wanted to go to MyGeotab and just say, hey, I want to log in with Google or with LinkedIn, we would need to support OAuth 2. So this is something that's come up. We are considering adding support for that. The idea of having a single URL, I think, is pretty cool. MyGeotab.com, no more number, and as I say, not the easiest thing to do, but we're looking at that. And then just the last thing is, as much as we kind of open, we don't want to have secrets, I also want to just put it out there that we've had very few limits imposed on people using the SDK. And I think it's part of the reason why it's been so successful. But in order for us to keep our systems healthy and up, we will have to put more and more limits in place just to ensure that there couldn't be an application that just starts making a tremendous amount of calls and therefore, ruining it for everybody else. So over time, we use our analytics to try and figure out what is the right balance. But for the most part, we want to ensure that we do it in a way that doesn't disable you guys, that you are able to build applications and consume the feeds at the rate that makes sense, at the same time protecting the infrastructure. So that's the end of our talk. I hope there was something in it for everybody. I know that we are out of time, but if you want to stick around, we can maybe look at some of the questions. Let me just have a look. I think there's a link here.
No, we can just go to the audience if anyone has any questions.
Sure.
I had a question about the VIN decoder.
Yeah.
So you mentioned American vehicles were fine, but there was issues with Europe. Were you talking about American made or delivered to America? And if it is made, then what about Japanese companies? I'm just trying to understand how reliable is the VIN decoder.
Yeah, so the VIN has been part of the OBD standard for a long time. So we can, when we plug into the engine diagnostics portal, we typically can get the VIN. the problem is that the VIN standard, the 17 characters that's in there, is supposed to have specific meaning. Like there's a checksum byte and so on. And what we do is we kind of decode it and we realize, hey, the checksum doesn't add up. And it's turned out that most vehicles that are sold in the US are sold in a way that they must adhere to that format. So it's really hit and miss in some of the other areas. I know for a fact that we've made some progress on Europe. I'm not sure about Japanese vehicles, but it is something that we can, well, if you mean like, Toyotas and so on, that's in America, they're fine, right? We do have a Japanese reseller selling in Japan. I don't know how well the VIN decoding works there.
Hi, this is Derek from Flexport. We are a heavy user on the SDK and also building our own ELD solution on top of Geotab. And one of the biggest difficulty that we have is around API versioning. So I was wondering if you guys consider about doing API versioning, because oftentimes we would experience API getting update with a newer version, and then we didn't anticipate that, and we realized that there's a breaking change happened, and then we found it out on production. And right now our solution is to subscribe to all the newsletter and YouTube and Twitter channel of Geotab. And I also heard of this maybe a testing server that you guys have.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and my recommendation or like suggestion is, if we have like an API version and then have an expiration date, then that would be like probably the easiest solution for everyone.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things. I have to admit there has been times when, inadvertently we change the behavior of the API and it would unexpectedly break something. It does happen. So there's a few things that we've done. The first is in the release notes of every release, we do actually put in there whenever we make a change to the API. So that's one place where you can go and look. There are a number of servers that we have that if you come through the support channel, ask our support team, we'll point out to you which of the servers are going to get a preview of the release coming up. And that's a great place if your integration, if you've built an integration, connected to that server even just to see everything's good. Because this typically happens weeks before it gets anywhere close to production. So there is the ability for you to see a preview of the changes. Now, we've tried our very best to keep existing APIs unaltered. So in the ELD space, a lot of things have been changing. So the regulations have changed. There's a number of things that's changed. So we were essentially forced to make some changes to that API on the fly. And I can understand that at certain times that breaks it. Versioning the API is something that we kind of foresaw right in the beginning. Even if you make a call, you'll see it's kind of API version 1. The problem that we have is it is extremely cumbersome for us to try and support n number of APIs, going back in time. So we kind of go for a more optimistic approach at this point, where we try and say we'll only add methods to the API, we'll only add properties to the objects. And I believe with enough heads up on future releases coming out, and if you participate in those programs, you'll be able to inform us on the forums, on GitHub, to say, hey, this is not behaving the way we should, and that we can rectify that before it becomes a problem for you in production.
I had a question about the Geotab Drive integration with single sign-on specifically. And right now it's a token authentication. I was wondering if there were plans to have other ways to launch the Geotab Drive app.
Yeah, so I know that there's actually an open case right now to add SAML support for the Drive app. Okay, so that's being worked on now. And we've got Mike in the audience there. Maybe you guys want to just have a quick chat. I don't know if you have anything to say about that right now, Mike, but I know that there's some other kind of in-app switching, so that if you're hosting the Drive app, that you can subscribe to certain events. There's quite a bit of work that's being done in that space, but it may be quite a detailed conversation. I would suggest, if you're interested in that, Mike is in the audience, and he would probably be the best guy to talk about that.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, I think maybe 2 more questions.
Hi, you didn't say anything about the MyAdmin SDK beta. Can you give us just a minute on that?
That's a good question. So the MyAdmin SDK is actually something completely separate, something not under my control. But I know for resellers and for people that order a lot of stuff, it's an important piece. So there's been quite a major overhaul of the MyAdmin API, and it is in beta. I'm not actually sure if there's a talk specifically on that topic, but maybe if you can talk to me afterwards, I'll give you contact details and we'll get you more information about that. Oh, actually, this guy, we said he can't ask any questions.
I know. I'm going to ask you a difficult question then. So I'm going to continue on the changes that you meant. I mean, you were talking about you making us dependent on the SDK, which is great. I mean, we are using those constantly. But the question that the gentleman back there had regarding changes, that how you want to make sure in future that mitigating any problem happening. Is there a possibility, for example, having a beta version of those 3 months, 4 months ahead of time, so for us to subscribe to those, test those, make sure that when you guys releasing those, there will not be any problem? Because as soon as you're releasing a new version, ours may not work anymore, and our customers getting suffered by that.
Yeah. So there's one other thing that I didn't mention, and that is in the last couple of releases, we've been looking at a different deployment model as well. So we call it kind of blue-green deployment, so that if we put a deployment out on a particular server, that we can immediately revert back to the previous version if we found that we broke something. So in the past, it would be very difficult, because once the version is there, we essentially have to upgrade it to the next version to fix whatever problem may be there. So again, just to reiterate, there are preview servers available today, and there's multiple stages of them. There's basically one that updates daily, there's one that updates weekly, and then there's one that kind of gets updated only on Wednesdays, and then there's the production. So there's actually layers of preview that you can get access to. Again, I think contact our support team. They will help you identify which are those servers, and you can go and create systems on there and help monitor basically that there isn't some corner case, some particular piece of information that you require that we've changed. The other thing to say is, I mean, we do thousands and thousands of integration tests every time we make a code change. So, it's not a case of we just throw it up there and hope for the best. We have automated tests that every time a code change is made that exercises these APIs and make sure that they don't break. The reality is, you guys have such diverse businesses and use cases that a slight change in behavior may break your particular use case. We could never have anticipated that. And we use that feedback to then create another test, and hopefully that never breaks again. So there are some additional things that we can do to try and keep systems up and running and give you a preview of what's to come. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Pavel, for your demos. It was really cool.